Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. Broadcasting throughout the world and around the United Kingdom, we're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. Broadcasting on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on TikTok. And as always, the best viewing experience can be found on our YouTube platform, youtube.com/UK A Force for Good. Now we've got a packed show for you this evening, and we're going to be talking about our very successful activism, which we had last Saturday in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow. And we're also going to be talking about the cost of living crisis. We're going to be talking about those crazy ScotNats who are out there, always surprising us with their crazy points of view. We're going to be looking at some of those. We've got Busting Indy Myths coming up, part 17. And we've also got our On This Day in British History. You know, I was just reading this article here about Sturgeon being an attention seeker. Calling First Minister an attention seeker is no insult to Scotland. No insult to Scotland. That appeared in the Daily Telegraph last Wednesday, in fact. And isn't it interesting how the Scottish nationalists always conflate the SNP with Scotland? John Swinney, apparently, who he holds some position, I don't know exactly what these days, but he goes that calling Sturgeon an attention seeker holds Scotland in contempt. It's always Scotland, isn't it? It's always Scotland. It's not holding Sturgeon in contempt, it's holding Scotland in contempt. Why do they do this? Very, very simple, folks. The reason is that the Scottish Nationalist Party supporters and true believers believe that the SNP is Scotland. So you hear them saying things like Scotland gets ignored in the House of Commons. What they mean is Ian Blackford might be getting ignored in the House of Commons. Well, he's not even getting ignored, he's getting listened to, but maybe he's not being treated with the majesty that they would prefer that he were treated with. So they go, Scotland is being treated with contempt, Scotland is being ignored. And we pointed this out in our little wee book for the Union, when we pointed out that Scotland never gets outvoted in the House of Commons, because no countries get outvoted. It's political parties and ideological tendencies which get outvoted. And this Scottish nationalist confusion, we said, arises from the fact that the SNP is not Scotland, as many of its supporters appear to believe. This makes them think that when the SNP gets outvoted, then Scotland is somehow being outvoted. That's in our little wee book for the Union. One of the myths that we bust. Derek says Sturgeon is the insult to Scotland. Hugo says evening from Yorkshire. Hello to Susie and to Senga from Ayrshire, and to Mark Yeti Sparkler Crib, who says keep up the good work. Well, keep up the good work yourself, Mark, and keep developing your musical talents, which I know you are very interested in doing. So what's Adam saying? Adam says you only got to look at the comment section to see what I was talking about. One of them was being xenophobic to me, my right being delegitimized and that I'm treated as a foreigner, all because I live in England and not in Scotland. I'm British, and Scotland, last time I checked, was in our country, the United Kingdom. Therefore, I do have a right to speak about Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish affairs. Amen to that, Adam. Absolutely. As we always say, if you're British, you're involved. And every person in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales has a perfect right to comment on Scottish politics. And if you believe in Britain, wherever in the world you are, you have a right to speak your mind about keeping Britain together because it's important to you. So don't listen to the Scottish nationalists. We always say that. You know, back in 2014, we heard some people saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't comment on it because I live in England. No. If you're British, you're involved. And you have every right to talk about it, because this is about, at the end of the day, it is about keeping our United Kingdom together. 100% so. Hi to Rita. Thanks for all your good work that you do for the cause, Rita. And Kenny points out Sturgeon has never listened to the 55%. She's completely ignored us. That's absolutely so. That's absolutely so. And I want to just mention a crazy ScotNat tweet this morning. And this guy was so pleased with himself that what he did was he sent the exact same tweet to a whole host of Scottish National Party MPs and MSPs and so on. The exact same quote with the exact same comment. And you're going to be shocked when I show you the comment here. It was a fellow who calls himself Indy because he sits in his car when he makes these broadcasts. But it's not a parody account, by the way. It's a real account. And he says here, he's addressing it to the SNP Member of Parliament called Martin Day, and he says, here is what must be done if Scotland votes yes. Unionist parties such as Scottish Conservatives, Scottish Labour and Scottish Lib Dems should become illegal and banned from our Parliament. Please watch the attached short video. Okay, so we did watch the attached short video and immediately we felt a decrease in our IQ while watching it, but he was perfectly serious about the fact that if they were ever to get their separation, they should ban parties that don't agree with the Scottish National Party. Did I make this up? No, there it is again. Here is what must be done if Scotland votes yes. Unionist parties such as Scottish Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems should become illegal and banned from our Parliament. I laugh, but you know, that's really serious because he's not the only person who thinks like that. Now remember, the Scottish nationalists are always saying, oh, you don't need to worry about that because if Scotland were to get independence, so-called, then the SNP will probably have achieved its purpose. It won't need to be around anymore and we can just have politics as normal. Oh, no. That's not going to be the case. Back in February, we pointed out that the Scottish National Party is not going our way regardless of what happens. And not to be fooled because they would continue to exist after separation. In fact, they would be much stronger after separation. Well, that was when we were presuming that they still would allow other parties to be allowed to contest. But it seems like now, far from the SNP going away after independence, in fact, they'll be the only party that's allowed if Mr. Indy who must be called John Duncan there, gets his way. They should become illegal and banned from our Parliament. Please watch the attached short video. I'm not going to play the attached short video for you, but that's essentially just what he says. Is that frightening? Is that worrying? I would say that it is concerning that there are people in Scotland with that attitude to democracy. You know, some people don't realise how serious this is. That chap's political party is running the country at the moment. Okay? If they thought they could be a one-party state, there's lots of people in that party who would agree to that. Sandra says it's Gordon Ross in a taxi. Right, that's his name, sorry. Gordon Ross in a taxi. Stuart wonders why he's wearing a patriotic Icelandic jumper. Good question. Well, that's for sure, Adam. AFFG would be banned and made illegal. Because think how much the Scottish nationalists try to get rid of British symbolism right now while we are in the Union. Imagine what they would do if we were out of the Union and they were the only game in town and they didn't have to answer to the British Parliament and they could look on the losing side with disdain and contempt and ignore them even more than they try to ignore them at present. They try to ignore the winning side at present, but how do you think they would react to the losing side? They would just totally dominate So that's always there, and we can't forget that. Nelson says, good evening, Alistair, and all fellow friends of unionist persuasion. Well, that's everybody on this team tonight. No question about that. SNP cult supporters, says Frankie, seem totally insane. Some of them absolutely do seem very strange. Christopher says the SNP founders were sympathisers of a certain side in World War II. And Susie says the SNP is a hungry crocodile which will never be satisfied. It must be voted out at the polls. Yep. Sturgeon says Stephen would become a dictator and ban elections. Certainly a lot of people who would love to ban elections and just stick to the system as it is at the moment. And she's really not doing very well. Here's a very good article. It says there, Indy Ref 2 is an addiction that Sturgeon has to kick. And below it here, SNP using drug deaths crisis to fuel separation debate, says charity chief. Now this is very important as a message. This came out in the Telegraph on the 5th of August, and it refers to a charity worker, a charity chief of a drugs addiction charity called Favour Scotland, and her name is Anne-Marie Ward, and she essentially walked out of, if you can do that on an online meeting, she must have closed it down and walked out because for the first time ever, she says, she could no longer tolerate the SNP civil servants' BS. And she said here, Miss Ward told reporters that although she is an SNP member and supports independence, she believes that the Sturgeon government is, quote, playing politics with the drugs issue by demanding that the UK government agrees to a change in the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. She claimed that SNP ministers and their spin doctors were using this dispute to, quote, fuel a proxy debate on independence, close quote, when the reality was, she insisted, quote, Scotland has all the powers it needs to treat people for addiction. Essentially what she's saying is that the SNP prefer to play politics, prefer to blame Westminster because there's a particular aspect of this Misuse of Drugs Act which is controlled by the British Parliament and which the British Parliament is not going to devolve. And it revolves around a highly controversial policy called shooting galleries, where the SNP wants it to be the law in Scotland that people can shoot up under certain circumstances under medical supervision. And this is prohibited by the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. And oh my goodness, the SNP are making such a big thing of this, as if they suddenly got that power devolved, then there's not going to be any drugs problem. So they're really concentrating on this piece of policy, which is very much a red herring as far as the overall drugs tragedy is concerned, because as this lady from this drugs addiction charity points out, they have all the powers at the moment in order to sort that situation. Okay, but people are dying because the SNP is playing politics with this, trying to blame deaths on some obscure policy, some obscure prohibition in the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, when in fact it's the SNP's inability to grasp this and have a real strong campaign against it, which is the problem. And that's so many things in Scotland are like that. Okay, now I noticed Sturgeon is speaking. She got interviewed today in the Fringe. I don't know how that went. It would probably just be an easy ride for her, but she's going to be out again on the 24th, okay, in Edinburgh, where she's being interviewed again. And I would like to think that these people, these interviewers, would ask her things like that, not let her off the hook, not allow her to quote some obscure chapter and verse in the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 and try to give the impression that that's where Scotland's drug problem is coming from, when in fact it's her inability as a leader and as an as a party and as a so-called government to get a proper grip on this matter. So, the people on TikTok who are the SNP supporters, do you have anything to say about that? What's your opinion on the high levels of death that are under the SNP at the moment, when the SNP has all the powers in order to sort it out? It's not enough just to say I'm wrong. You have to be able to point out why I am wrong on that particular matter. And so please do. And if you've got a lot to say, then please do say it, because I'm sure a certain Madam Sturgeon would be very interested in your considered opinion. TC just says we are all affected by Sturgeon and her following, and therefore we all have an opinion on it regardless of where in the United Kingdom we live. Absolutely. And Carol Lynn says the last thing Sturgeon actually wants is to hold another referendum. We're going to be touching on that in our Busting Indy Myths, as we're going to look at one of the key arguments that she has been promoting. But before we get to that, I want to talk about, and I want to show you some pictures from our amazing Saturday event. Now, on Saturday, we had our 8th Jubilee Street Stall in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, which was in Argyle Street. And let me bring up some photographs of that. Now, you won't see that on TikTok, but you'll certainly see it on the other channels here. And there's a picture of our street stall, looking very busy. Lots of people around it. We've got the Queen's Jubilee flag and our AFFG flag there, and we've got our talented table team working on it. There they are in the heat of the action. And that's a chap there with a fantastic Proud to be British t-shirt. And the lady behind the counter there is modelling our Scottish and British t-shirt, which you can get from our teespring.com store. And more heat of the action there. Look at all these beautiful Union flags. Now, what we were expecting and what we got was a small Scottish nationalist march who had set off at noon from across the River Clyde and were bearing down upon us, and they would pass us. We've got pictures of them in a moment just coming up. Thank you to the photographers who took these photographs, by the way. They're crackers. And I love this one. I love this one. Check that out. That's 8 of our table team looking all very happy and pleased with themselves, as rightly they should. Great photograph there. We'll get that out on the internet in due course. And also here we are just getting ready to face up to the Scottish nationalists as they passed. And very colourful, and there's a good picture of one of our key activists talking to a member of the public who was supporting us. Great picture. What I also did was I did a half-hour live during the course of it with the help of a couple of colleagues. And while this is actually me with my my megaphone waiting on the Scottish nationalists to come along, and also with the live broadcast equipment there in my right hand. And here are the Scottish nationalists passing us. That's a shot from behind our thin red line. There's a shot from side on as I'm talking to them. Now, last year I sang them a wee song. This year I didn't sing them a wee song. I just simply concentrated on the importance of appreciating our great and wonderful United Kingdom. And this is the leader of the Scottish Nationalists. I don't know quite what he's doing there or what's happened to his back, but I think he must be wearing a rucksack or something under his high-vis vest, because he looks like Quasimodo. No harm to him, but he does look very ungainly in that setup, I have to say. Come on, mate. And here we are. A Force for Good's flag flying nicely in the background as I'm delivering the key points of our message to them. Here we go again as they're coming round. And here is another picture closer up of the megaphone with our fantastic wee stickers on it. And just to end this little gallery of photographs, let's end with our chap's Proud to be British t-shirt. There you go, proud to be British. And every single one of those folk at that event on that day were proud to be British, and I thank them very much. And there was 108 Scottish nationalists past us, and they passed us in 47 seconds. Kenny says that a friend of his, also from East Kilbride, got a survey through the door with an independence score from 0 to 10. That's interesting. That sounds like it would possibly be a stunt from the local SNP people. One would be able to tell that. There's usually small print at the bottom of a leaflet, at the bottom of a political leaflet. By law, it has to say who it's printed and published by, and on whose behalf it's published. So if you read the small print, it might be the SNP itself that would be paying for that. And unless it's a so-called Scottish government leaflet, then it's the SNP who pay for it out of their own party funds. But if it's a Scottish government leaflet, which is also SNP propaganda, then it's you and I who pay for that. Catherine says, fantastic event on Saturday. Stuart has a low impression of the people who were trudging after the Scottish nationalist leader there on that march. 108 from a nationalist stronghold. Well, that's right, isn't it? It's proving every day to be, in fact, the great British city of Glasgow, and not the nationalist stronghold that they pretend it to be. Now, on this day in British history, because British history matters, because it matters where we are. And we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we are if we do not know where we have been. And certainly on this day in British history, there would be certain people who were in a certain Langham Place in London when there was the first ever Proms. You know, they talk about the last night of the Proms. Well, what about the first night of the Proms? And what does Proms even mean? And what's that all about? Because the last night of the Proms has become one of these sort of established British cultural institutions. Well, the very first night of the Proms was this night, 10th of August in 1895, when a certain Robert Newman organised the first of, quote, Mr. Robert Newman's promenade concerts. Now, the word proms comes from the word promenade, which comes from the French term se promener, which means to walk. And promenade concerts were musical concerts in the pleasure gardens of London, where the audience would just stroll about while listening to the music rather than sitting down. So Mr. Robert Newman saw an opportunity here, thought, why can't we do that inside? Because inside, when you go to a concert, most people have to sit quietly in the rows and so on. Why don't we have a concert inside where people can walk about? Blue sky thinking, right? Blue sky thinking. He was the first to come up with that concept. So, and he thought, you know, that will attract people who don't want to sit down all the time, and it will be less formal, and we can attract people by lower prices because there's no seats, and we can have a more informal attitude towards drinking and smoking and eating at the same time. So his attempt was basically to, in the modern parlance, make classical music more inclusive to the great numbers of people of that day. And in fact, he stated his aim, quote, I am going to run nightly concerts and I'm going to train the public by easy stages. Right, this guy's got it all figured out. Popular at first, gradually raising the standard until I have created a public appetite for classical and modern music. So he'd probably start off with, my old man's a dustman, my old man's a dustman, he wears a dustman's hat. And then it would like graduate up to, without people even consciously realising, graduate up to like Brahms and Beethoven. And people are like, well, I thought I was just listening to My Old Man's a Dustman a minute ago. So that's how he did it, way before his time, that guy. He should have been a social media influencer. He was a social media influencer back in the day. So today, 10th of August, 1895, was the very first night of the Proms, and it was held in the Queen's Hall in Langham Palace. And since then, there's been all sorts of stuff, and they've even got proms in the park. They haven't had proms in the park for a few years now because of the COVID carry-on, but that's a picture of proms in the park. I think that's Hyde Park, looking at that. Absolutely. So, what else on this day in British history? This day, 10th of August in 1965, was part of the 5-day Royal Fleet Review in the Clyde, when the Royal Navy in all its glory steamed up and parked itself in the Clyde between the 5th and 11th of this month. And there's been only 2 fleet reviews which have taken place in Scotland during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and the first took place in 57, but this was the one that took place in 1965, and there hasn't been one since. And there's only one picture that I could find in the entire World Wide Web of that. I think that's seen from Greenock, looking down from, I believe that's Tower Hill, and that's just some of the ships that were parked in the Clyde for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II to kind of row about and look at them as if they were soldiers on parade, and that's called a fleet review. And so that was taking place on this day back in 1965 as well. Great stuff there, British history. Love it to bits. And talking about the Royal Navy there, right? A really good tweet this morning from this chap. Keith goes, "This is what happens when shipbuilding isn't controlled by the SNP. It works." And there he's got a picture of HMS Glasgow currently being built down at the BAE Systems shipyard on the Clyde. And that's the first of 8 frigates which are being built down there for the Royal Navy. And the Type 26 programme, it's called, supports more than 4,000 jobs across the UK. So that's an example of British government shipbuilding. And I'm afraid we don't have any examples worthy of showing you of so-called Scottish government shipbuilding, because it's a concept that doesn't yet exist. It has not been able to manifest itself properly in this earthly realm. However, British shipbuilding, as far as military shipbuilding, is in fairly good health. I say fairly because, you know, and this annoys me, but let me get to it. There's also things called Royal Fleet Auxiliary Ships. And these are ships which are run by the Merchant Navy, but they cater to and they supply the Royal Navy ships. For example, the aircraft carriers are supplied with various provisions and oils and diesels and so on by the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which is not part of the Royal Navy. Now, hitherto, and at the moment, all Royal Navy ships are built in Britain for security purposes. However, the stupid British government hitherto would put out the Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship contracts for tenders worldwide, and they would always go worldwide. They wouldn't build them in Britain. Oh, because we're saving some money. Total false economy. If you give £1.5 billion to South Korea to build your ships, then that's £1.5 billion that's lost to the British economy. That's £1.5 billion that's never coming back in taxes. That's £1.5 billion that doesn't percolate around the economy, that doesn't pay for local goods and services, which doesn't get into the hands of workers, which doesn't contribute to the British economy. It's all just lost to the British economy. So all this idea of saving money because you build abroad, largely is false economy. So there's 3 new Royal Fleet auxiliary ships that need to be built. And as late as November 2019, the British government was defending their right to build them abroad, to give this 1 billion, possibly 1.5 billion contract to shipyards abroad. It was defending that. And we got so enraged by this, and one of our policies in our magazine, Do More Together, is build all Royal Fleet auxiliary ships in the UK. It should be a no-brainer. And that's in our magazine, Do More Together. And, however, what happened was, when this got around, there was people on the internet, ourselves included and others, who set up a petition, and for a few days we were able to create quite a bit of a stir about this. And believe it or not, the Ministry of Defence, in a few months later, they published a review called the National Shipbuilding Strategy. And in this National Shipbuilding Strategy, the person who was coordinating it said there is significant parliamentary, industry and public interest in increasing the number of categories of ships eligible for UK-only competition. And the person commissioning this said, I recommend that UK-only competition should be considered for future defence-funded vessels, by which he meant RFA. And so when they got that National Shipbuilding Strategy, then and only then at that point did the Tories change their tune, and they relaunched the tender. But this time they said the successful bidder can work in partnership with international companies, but would be required to integrate the ships in a UK shipyard. And as far as I can tell, that is the situation at the moment. Although an article appeared in yesterday's Daily Mirror where a union leader from the CSEU, the General Secretary Ian Waddell, was just emphasising the strategic importance for the industry and the country of making sure that this contract does go to largely British firms at the end of the day. We believe these ships should be designed, built and maintained in Britain as part of our sovereign capability as an island nation to build ships. We want either Sunak or Truss to support our 5 tests, support British shipbuilding and allay once and for all fears that jobs outside London and the South East will be levelled down. So that's just something to keep an eye on, but it's an easy win for the incoming Prime Minister to make sure that goes to a British yard, and that'll be more good work for the people of our wonderful United Kingdom. Now, fantastic. Where are we? Now, what I want to speak about now is related to something that came up earlier as well. And it's busting Indy Myths. Busting Indy Myths on the daily, weekly, monthly and yearly until the ScotNats see clearly that we're down with the capital A to the double FG. In this Busting Indy Myths part 17, we're going to address the oft-heard myth that somehow international law conveys some kind of right upon Scotland to self-determination. The idea that when the British government and the British Parliament say that they don't want us to have a so-called second referendum, that the Scottish nationalists will say, oh, but international law allows every country to have the right to self-determination. Oh, it's written in law, and so on and so forth. Well, what's all that about? And the reason it came into our consciousness recently was because believe it or not, that's one of the arguments that the Scottish National Party are taking to the UK Supreme Court. They are claiming that under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was ratified, which was agreed upon by the United Kingdom in 1976, that Scotland has some sort of international right to self-determination. Well, what does that covenant actually say? It says this, quote, "All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development," close quote. Well, does that somehow give the Scottish National Party the right on its own to have a second referendum? As I say, that's an argument. It's one of the core arguments that's being submitted to the UK Supreme Court. Well, actually, we're here today to tell you, quite frankly, that self-determination under international law does not apply to Scotland's situation. Let me explain. Is there a country in the democratic Western world that has wrestled with this question recently? Has a Supreme Court of a democratic Western nation looked at this question and come up with an answer? And that's the first thing that we would look at. And the answer is yes. In 1995, Quebec had attempted to separate from the rest of the Canadian Federation with a referendum. And in 1998, Canada's Supreme Court looked at this covenant and adjudicated upon it, made a judgment upon what it actually meant and whether or not it was relevant to Quebec's situation. And they basically came up with the fact that the concept was not intended for countries which already have internal self-determination, which already have internal democracy. Let me read out the judgment for you. The court's conclusion said, quote, "A right to succession only arises under the principle of self-determination of people at international law, where a people," inverted commas in the text here, "is governed as part of a colonial empire, where a people is subject to alien subjugation, domination or exploitation, and possibly where a people is denied any meaningful exercise of its right to self-determination within the state of which it forms a part. In other circumstances, people are expected to achieve self-determination within the framework of their existing state. Quote, "A state whose government represents the whole of the people or peoples resident within its territory on a basis of equality and without discrimination and respects the principles of self-determination in its internal arrangements is entitled to maintain its territorial integrity under international law and to have that territorial integrity recognised by other states." And it was saying there that Canada does exercise internal self-determination. All parts of Canada exercise internal self-determination on a basis of equality and without discrimination. And everybody in Canada is respecting the principles of that in its internal arrangements. And so this idea that international law somehow demands that Quebec can break away isn't correct, because Quebec is not part of a colonial empire. Its people are not subject to, quote, alien subjugation, domination or exploitation, and they already possess, in terms of equality and non-discrimination, they already possess the means to have their point of view known. And so they have to work that within the bounds of the existing state that they find themselves in, rather than appealing to international law. So we can state very clearly, to conclude, that under international law, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is not a relevant document for Scotland. Scotland does not meet the requirements of being part of a colonial empire. It does not meet the requirements of being subject to, quote, alien subjugation, domination or exploitation, despite what some of the nationalists might imagine. And it certainly, from our perspective, does not apply to a country which self-determined in 2014 overwhelmingly to stay part of the United Kingdom, and which then subsequently self-determined in 2015, in 2017 and in 2019 to send representatives to the British Parliament. So the right of self-determination under international law does not apply to Scotland's situation. And you know, that's without us even getting into the matter of the difference between accepting a principle and accepting a practice that derives from that principle. What do I mean? For example, ScotNats will say to us, oh, do you believe in the principle of the self-determination of the Scottish people? And we'll say, well, yes. And they'll say, well, then you should give us another referendum. You should want another referendum. No, that doesn't follow. Because I believe in a principle, that doesn't mean that I'm going to believe in a certain practice of it. For example, I believe strongly in the principle of drinking water. I don't believe in the practice of you trying to force water down my throat. Okay? Just because I believe in drinking water doesn't mean that I want you to force water down my throat. So there is a difference between accepting a principle and accepting a particular practice that might derive from that principle. So we can believe in the principle of something, but we can differ on how it should be practiced. And we should certainly oppose the practice of something if it's going to result in something that we don't want. We can believe in the self-determination of the people. We can believe in the principle of that without believing that in practice we should always be having referendums in order to try deliberately to destroy the United Kingdom. Okay, so the principle is different from the practice, because when it comes to the practice of the principle, we all have our own interests which we need to defend. So in this case, we are opposing a practice, which is to say the referendum. We're not opposing the principle of self-determination per se. Okay, so that's something that never gets brought out properly. I hope I brought it out there for the first time. There's a difference between principle and practice. You can believe in a principle without believing in a particular practice that might derive from that principle. Good stuff. Now, we have got in the office, I'm glad to say, we've taken a new delivery of these amazing books called Scotland Now, A Warning to the World by Professor Tom Gallagher. And this was written shortly after, first published in the United Kingdom in 2016. It remains the best book from a pro-UK perspective that's been written on the 2014 referendum. We were selling these at £15. Because we've taken a limited new delivery of them, we're able to reduce the price to £12.99, and you'll find them at our shop. Okay, you'll find that at aforceforgood.uk/shop. Reduced. What a book. A remarkable series of events in Scotland means that Scottish nationalism has never been closer to realising its goal. If it succeeds, a territorial union which has been an anchor of stability in Western Europe and a durable influence much further afield will be no more. In Scotland, its ageing post-industrial population will confront sharp economic challenges, yet a giddy, risk-taking mood prevails. Populists like Nicola Sturgeon enjoy celebrity status for their skill in whipping up grievances, even though the British Parliament allows Scotland internal self-government on generous financial terms. A really good piece of work. It's one of these books that you'll read with a pencil and underline stuff, mark the paragraphs, come back to it. Oh, it's a good way of putting it or talking about it or whatever. Check it out, folks. Good. And also, as I mentioned there, Do More Together, that's also available. That's also available in our shop. And we do push the merchandise, folks, because that's what keeps our show on the road. Absolutely. And just checking some of the comments there on TikTok. And also here. Exactly, Christopher says, ironically, the SNP don't believe in the principle of self-determination when people vote to stay in the Union. Ian says, in 2014, Scotland determined itself to be part of Britain. An analogy would be the principle of democracy does not necessitate monthly elections or multiple referenda per lifetime. Yes, that's right. The principle of democracy does not necessitate a practice of monthly elections. Absolutely. You can believe in the principle of democracy but not believe in having a referendum every month. Good point, Ian. What does this button do says, even if the SNP managed to wrangle another referendum and bizarrely won, it would still just be a draw with no decision made until the third one another decade later. It's summertime and we at A Force for Good, our staff have to take little holidays as well, of course. And so this programme, Good Evening Britain, will not be getting broadcast for the next 2 Wednesdays. Okay, so we're not going to be here next Wednesday, and we're not going to be here the Wednesday thereafter due to staff taking holidays and enjoying this beautiful weather, as they're certainly entitled to do. Of course, as an organisation, we're still going to be publishing every day on our socials, but this programme, this Wednesday programme, will not be getting broadcast in the next fortnight. But we're also having 3 events in the next 4 weeks, and we'll keep those who want to know about it in the loop. So if you'd like to join us for outdoor events in the next 4 weeks, send us an email and tell us that you're interested in coming along, because as you saw from those pictures earlier, great groups of people loving the outdoor events, and really it's really worth your while to meet pro-UK unionists. And so we've got 3 big events, and believe me, these are going to get into the media. They absolutely are. They're very exciting what we've got lined up, but we're not going to be broadcasting. And that's also one of the reasons that we're not going to be broadcasting, because we're going to be busy doing outdoor events as well. So we won't be here next week, and we won't be here the week after. So folks, thank you very much for everything. Stuart says happy halls. Thank you for that. Nathan says congratulations to Jonathan Ben, as does Harry, as does Stuart, as does Debbie, say congratulations, as does Catherine, as does Stephen. Nathan says it feels like Scotland has been in an old firm game for the last 15 years under the SNP, with all the hatred and divisions they've stoked in Scotland. It's so sad, isn't it really? Paul says SNP supporters often deny the existence of the British as a nation or a people. In contrast, unionists accept other national identities and their right to self-determination. Absolutely. Absolutely. We certainly do. Catherine says, have a lovely holiday. And Nelson says, happy days to those taking a well-deserved break. And Janet says, you deserve a well-earned rest. Well, thank you. Thank you. There's a limit to how much rest we can actually take when we're constantly being bombarded every day. But we try to switch off as much as possible. But usually without success. Oh, yes, indeed. Well, folks, it just remains for me to say to thank everybody for all your comments coming in. An hour passed very quickly there. Really enjoyable. Thank you for all the comments which I read out. Thank you for taking part in the show. We're going to be back at the end of the month. We won't be here next week or the week after. So folks, it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the Queen. See you next time.